My last three programs have dealt with the philosophy of Seneca, a very famous Stoic philosopher of antiquity. This program will deal with an equally famous Stoic philosopher who was also a Roman emperor. Indeed, some historians and other scholars believe that Plato's idea of the philosopher king was realized in this philosopher, and the man I'm alluding to is Marcus Aurelius. Marcus Aurelius, while emperor of the Roman Empire, kept a journal, and his journal was later published and became known as the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And we are fortunate enough to be able to procure the book today. Indeed, any good bookstore has this book. Again, it's entitled The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. This book is a collection of the emperor's thoughts on virtually every dimension of the human experience. His journal was originally entitled To Himself, and in this book he gives advice to himself and reminds himself about certain aspects of dealing with daily living that he doesn't want to forget. So in giving advice to himself and reminding himself about certain important things in life, in reading his book, he's also giving us advice and reminding us about certain things we should keep in mind if we wish to live more fulfilling lives. Librarians usually classify his book under the heading philosophy, and rightly so. Despite the fact that Marcus Aurelius's Meditations was written approximately 2,000 years ago, it is still very, very relevant to us today. As I've mentioned in previous programs, so much of what the great thinkers have said is really timeless, and that their advice, philosophy, so to speak, applies to all generations. Marcus Aurelius was a Stoic philosopher, and let me just spend 1 minute or so reminding you about what the major tenets were of the Stoic philosophy. Stoicism was a philosophy founded about 300 years before Jesus Christ, and among its basic teachings were the following. The Stoics taught that life is difficult, but we make it more difficult than it need be by our reactions to what happens to us. The Stoics also believed there is a moral order in the universe. And what does that mean? Well, the Stoics believed that when we act virtuously, when we act decently, this will result in more personal happiness for us. Whereas, when we do something evil, that will hurt us in the sense that that will impair our efforts to become happier. The Stoics believed that happiness stealers hurt themselves. Even though the Stoics believed there was a moral order in the universe, they placed little or no emphasis on the idea of a personal God. And according to the Stoics, what constitutes the good life? Well, I've already mentioned they believe that primarily the good life consists in trying to be a good human being, that in trying to be a good human being, that will result in greater happiness for us. But they also believed that virtue encompasses some other important characteristics. For example, self-discipline and fortitude and perseverance. Indeed, Marcus Aurelius said this, and I'm quoting him, "Accept without resignation whatever may befall you." Again, accept without resentment, whatever may befall you. A Stoic, in a certain sense, and this is the sense my guess is you're familiar with, are considered to be tough people, emotionally tough people. The Stoics also believed that the good life consisted of rendering service to other people. And Marcus Aurelius, time and time again, in his journal, again entitled The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, talks about the importance of rendering service to other people. The Stoics also believed that we should be very skeptical about the majority and how the majority of people think. The Stoics believed that only a minority of people have wisdom. It is interesting that Christianity absorbed a great deal of Stoicism. You recall I mentioned that Stoicism was founded about 300 years before Christ. Among the ideas that Christianity inherited from Stoicism, inherited might be too strong a word, let's say adopted from Stoicism, were the following. All people are brothers, and it's important to render service to other people. Allow me a brief overview of the life of Marcus Aurelius. He was born in AD 121 into the Roman Empire. Again, he was born approximately 100 years after Christian scholars believed Jesus was crucified. In 161 AD, at the age of 40, Marcus Aurelius became a co-Roman emperor. That's right, there were two Roman emperors at this time. In 169 AD, when his co-emperor died, Marcus Aurelius became the sole Roman emperor and had that position until he died at age 59 in the year 180 AD. So he served in one way or another as a Roman emperor and the Roman emperor for approximately 19 years. As emperor, Marcus Aurelius was renowned for his justice and humanity. Indeed, history's verdict on his emperorship is this, that Marcus Aurelius was a ruler who was truly concerned about the happiness of his subjects. Marcus Aurelius experienced great personal tragedy. 4 of his 5 children and his wife died before he did. And during his tenure as emperor, a plague spread through the Roman Empire. In addition to that, floods wreaked havoc on the farmland of Rome and its adjoining area, and these floods destroyed much of the grain crop. Indeed, Marcus Aurelius had to sell the royal jewelry in order to relieve his subjects of much of the famine they were suffering from. In addition to plague and natural disasters, Marcus Aurelius's reign as emperor was plagued by barbarian invasions. Now on to the book itself. Again, the very famous Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Early on in his journal, he tells us that we must learn from experience if we wish to live fulfilling lives. Here are his own words. Nothing so enlarges the mind as the ability to methodically and accurately examine every one of life's experiences. Marcus Aurelius believed that one of the distinguishing characteristics between wise people and unwise people is that wise people tend to learn from their mistakes, again having evaluated their experiences well, whereas unwise people tend not to learn from their mistakes and tend to continue to make the same mistakes through much, if not all, of their lives. Marcus Aurelius believed we must digest our experiences in a way in which we digest food. He reminds me of Socrates in this sense. Socrates also attached much importance to evaluating our experiences, and he said this, and again I'm quoting Socrates, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The idea is that in evaluating our experiences, that will result in greater understanding. And greater understanding will help free us from false ideas we may have about ourselves and life. The philosopher Santayana put it this way: wisdom comes by disillusionment. In other words, wisdom comes by freeing ourselves from false ideas. And the idea is, if we free ourselves from false ideas, we will experience less grief in daily living. And what might help us to better evaluate our experiences? Well, I think it's fair to say that great books in philosophy, psychology, religion, science, literature can help provide illumination. Indeed, Noam Chomsky, the very famous MIT professor of linguistics, has said this: we will probably always learn more about ourselves from novels than from science. I think it's also fair to say that besides books, other things that can help us to evaluate our experiences are art, music, good teachers, and conversations with thinking, compassionate, introspective people. Marcus Aurelius claimed that our emotions often get in the way of our understanding. Indeed, he pointed out that our fear, anger, lust, greed, jealousy often impair our ability to think well. In his book, again entitled The Meditations, which, as I pointed out, was really his journal, he said this, and I'm quoting Marcus Aurelius: "Which of these emotions is clouding my understanding at this very moment? Fear, greed, jealousy, or some other?" The idea is, if we wish to understand ourselves and other people better, and life better, we must learn to gain greater control over our emotions. For example, jealousy and anger can blind us to the true nature of things. Aurelius comments specifically on the destructiveness of anger, and here are his own words: "Our anger and annoyance are more detrimental to us than the things that cause our anger or annoyance." If I were very angry at this moment, I could not do this program. My anger would interfere with my ability to concentrate. And if I had been very angry when preparing the script for this program, I don't think I could have done a very good job, because again, my anger would have interfered with my ability to concentrate and think clearly. And what might be some of the antidotes to anger? Well, focusing the mind on something other than our anger. For me, for example, reading, music, physical exercise, trying to be of service to other people. And it's also important, if we cannot overcome our anger, and anger can be difficult to overcome, we can at least deal with it wisely. And what are examples of people dealing with their anger wisely? People such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. They both remind me of something Ernest Hemingway said. Hemingway, the famous writer, said this about anger. He said, "Anger can be a prelude to courage." And I think the lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela give testimony to that idea that anger can be a prelude to courage. And they are two gentlemen who use their anger very wisely, who use their anger in a very constructive way to try to make the world a better place. Aurelius believed that we should seek emotional refreshment not in the external world, but in ourselves. Let me say that again. Marcus Aurelius believed we should seek emotional refreshment not in the external world, but rather in ourselves. In his journal, he said that we don't need to go on a vacation to the seashore or to the mountains. He said this, and again I'm quoting him: "At any moment you choose, you can retire to within yourself. He goes on to say, nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in one's soul. He goes on to say that a person who has cultivated his or her mind and soul has greater inner resources he or she can access to secure immediate ease of mind. Those are his words. The idea is that if we have cultivated our minds and souls, we can retire to within ourselves and access inner resources that can help us to achieve great tranquility. He goes on to say that one should regularly retire to within oneself. His own words here. Avail yourself often of this retirement, and so continually renew yourself. The Stoics emphasized self-reliance, self-sufficiency, and self-therapy. The idea is that vacations to the seashore or mountains or exotic places may not help much. Socrates was once told by one of his associates that he knew of a man who claimed that vacation trips didn't help him very much to relax. And Socrates' response was this. He said, well, of course, a vacation trip does him no good, since he has to take himself along. And not only himself along, but in taking himself along, take all his emotional baggage along with him. Ralph Waldo Emerson put it this way. Emerson wrote of a person taking his sad, nervous self to sunny Italy, only to wake up in Naples, finding that his sad, nervous self was still with him. The key is this: changes in one's thinking, changes in one's attitudes is what is needed. A vacation in one's mind, a vacation in one's mind entails silence, solitude, and deep listening to oneself. Of course, vacations in our mind can also be facilitated by reading good books, wisdom books, meditation books. Marcus Aurelius' book, the one I'm talking about now, is a very good book, I think, that can help us to take a vacation in our mind and which can help us to think more clearly. I think Seneca's books help me very much to take a vacation in my mind. Also, I've mentioned the Buddhist holy book, the Dhammapada, I find very useful. The Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, I find very helpful. And, of course, the New Testament. I find all of these books to be, in one way or another, meditation books, wisdom books, which help me and facilitate me in taking a vacation in my mind. I also mentioned last week, as Seneca did, that we can all write our own meditation books. In other words, write down quotes in a book, quotes that you have taken from books you have read or I have read, quotes you might take from a magazine article, a newspaper article, that you find particularly perceptive and that you don't want to forget. And what you can do is what I do, and that is periodically review my meditation books that I have written, again, books consisting of quotes, and also I've mentioned to you, I habitually write quotations on 3x5 index cards. I find that I can get great solace from a quotation or even a poem. Indeed, Harold Bloom, the very famous professor of literature, of the humanities actually, at Yale and at NYU, he has said that when he's feeling down, he often chants Walt Whitman's poetry, and he says that helps him to take a vacation in his mind. I wonder if some of you might find that helpful, again, to chant some poetry that you might find very much to your liking. The Stoics also remind us that thinking about death in a mature way can also provide solace. Tolstoy said this, and he sounds very much like a Stoic here. And is it worth tormenting oneself when one has only a moment to live in comparison with eternity? The great Renaissance Italian painter Masaccio provides some illumination here, I think. In one of his great paintings, entitled The Trinity, he has a skeleton lying in a tomb. The skeleton represents all of us. And above the skeleton, there is an inscription, again in this painting, and the inscription says this: I was once what you are, and what I am, you will become. Facing up to our mortality is very Stoic. The idea is that Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, and Epictetus, another very famous Stoic thinker, were in a certain sense tough guys. They were able to face up to their mortality and encourage us to do so. They encourage us not to fear death, but to look death in the face. And they believe that facing up, I should say they believed that facing up to our mortality makes life more meaningful. The idea is that thinking about death is a reminder that our time to live, to love, and to experience is limited. It's also a reminder that we should love other people in the present moment, because either ourselves or themselves may not be here tomorrow. Thoreau said something enlightening, I believe, on this subject. He talked about a fertile sadness. Those are his words, a fertile sadness. Here's what he had to say. There is a certain fertile sadness I would not avoid, but earnestly seek. It is positively joyful to me. It saves my life from being trivial. Thoreau went on to say that men die of fright and live of confidence. Again, that's very Stoic. And it's not a coincidence that Thoreau said things that are very reminiscent of the Stoics, because Thoreau had read the Stoics. He had read Marcus Aurelius and Seneca and Epictetus and borrowed many of his ideas from them. One of the Stoics' basic themes is how to deal with adversity. Aurelius believed that we bring much pain on ourselves. He said this: if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your own estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Again, the idea is that difficulty and pain, that so much of the difficulty and pain we experience in life is made worse by our reaction to it. And if we could react differently to the adversity in our lives, we will suffer a lot less. Aurelius goes on to say that difficulty and pain have been experienced by all people since the beginning of time. His own words. If a man is afraid of pain, he is afraid of something happening which will be part of the appointed order of things. And again, he goes on to point out that every generation of human beings has found much adversity in daily living. Remember Marcus Aurelius' personal tragedies, losing 4 of his 5 children as well as his wife before he died. You recall that Seneca was exiled to the island of Corsica for 8 years as a punishment inflicted on him by the Roman emperor of his time. And also Epictetus, the other very famous Stoic philosopher, had been a slave at one time. But also remember, the Stoics believed we can experience tranquility and even joy, but it requires the proper mindset. It requires the proper attitudes. Aurelius talked about the benefits of adversity. Again, his own words. A man becomes better and more praiseworthy by the right uses he makes of adversity. By the right uses he makes of adversity. The idea is there is some compensation, even in disappointment and suffering. Thoreau put it this way: if we will be quiet and ready enough, we shall find compensation in every disappointment. The great religions and the great philosophers teach that life is made significant by the struggle. Difficulties can wake us up. Difficulties can give us perspective on what's really important in life. And the idea is, as we grow older, if we have not used our pain as an excuse to inflict pain on other people, but rather have tried to lighten other people's pains, that can result in an earned self-respect. And self-respect, as so many of the great thinkers have said, is really the cornerstone of joy. What I'd like to do now is to close with a quote from Marcus Aurelius, which I think provides a good summary statement about his philosophy. He raises the question, what's the good life? And he goes on to say, the good life essentially consists of cultivating insights about life, and also it consists of goodness, fair dealing, practicing the golden rule. Again, his own words. Cultivate a thorough insight into things. Put your whole heart into doing what is just. And know the joy of life by piling good deed on good deed until no rift or cranny appears between them. Finally, Henry David Thoreau reminds us that we are all artists. In Walden, he penned the following words: to affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.